Richard, it's really thrilling to have you here. Scary times, interesting times, shocking times in international relations. So we are really grateful, to have Richard sort of shed some lights on his interpretations of what particularly U.S. Japan relations in the Trump administration, in the current Trump administration, how they're going to evolve, what the challenges and what the opportunities are. And without further ado, Richard, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thanks for moderating and hosting, and thanks for everybody for being here. It's great to be back in Tokyo after a few years now. I thought I would start by stepping kind of way back from the specifics of the U.S. Japan relationship and look at some of the fundamentals of U.S. foreign policy and U.S. foreign economic policy that are really being questioned and potentially kind of thrown into some upheaval now, because that is what is the backdrop against which I think the current administration is thinking about its relationships with countries like Japan, and also its presence in Asia and its overall kind of approach to the world. For 80 years now, it has been relatively, there's been a relative consensus about some key principles of U.S. foreign policy. Three really key ones. One was that in order to keep the peace, the U.S. should have strong alliances underwritten by the forward deployment of American troops. So American troops stayed in Japan and Europe after World War II, and unlike before the war, they never came home. And we would build these strong alliances both in Asia and in Europe. The second was, in order to increase prosperity for Americans, not least, the United States would favor an open international economic system that was underwritten by progressively freer trade. And then the third was to support the forces of freedom in the world and protect our own freedoms at home. When possible, we would have a bias in favor of democracies rather than autocracies. And so much of the debates over the years between Republicans and Democrats and liberals and conservatives and this president and that president was more about how to implement those, what the limits were, how to do these things. It was about how big a defense budget do you need, how much free trade, what do you actually protect, what do you do with friendly autocrats, these kinds of things like that. But there wasn't that much questioning of the fundamental assumptions themselves. And starting with the first Trump administration, and now really accelerating in the few months in the second Trump administration, you really see some fundamental questioning and sort of skepticism by the administration about these very core subjects. Is an open international economic system underwritten by free trade good for Americans, or did foreign countries steal our jobs and result in the de-industrialization and manufacturing of the United States and all these other things like that? Are allies good for the security and protection of the United States, or do they free ride under the protection of the United States and just get rich without paying their sort of fair share and things like that? Should we support the forces of democracy abroad because ultimately that makes our own freedoms more secure, or does that mean we just poke our noses in the business of other people who aren't interested in American lecturing and things like that? And so that is, I would say, skepticism. The administration hasn't overturned those assumptions, but they certainly are skeptical of them. And the way that ends up kind of butting up against some of the more traditional approaches to U.S. foreign policy, including toward Japan, including toward Asia, I think results in some of what you've seen so far from the administration. Of course, the other part of what's going on now, in addition to sort of some of the skepticism of globalization and alliances and free trade and things like that, is the phenomenon of Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea working together more closely than ever before. If you had said even a few years ago that there would be, tens of thousands of North Korean troops fighting in Europe, all of us would have been shocked by the notion. And of course, that's the case right now. So you have where some skepticism about the way the world works now and the way it's been ordered among the administration, you have this sort of rejection of the way the world has been ordered by these revisionist powers. So this is kind of the big backdrop, I think, for U.S.-Japan relations. And U.S.-Japan ties are really at the center of so much of this, no matter what it is you're talking about, the economic side on trade or the alliance side when it comes to security in Asia or with respect to China and Russia and so on. So as I said a second ago, the skepticism also bumps up against some more kind of traditional approaches by the current administration. So when Secretary of Defense Hegseth was at the Shangri-La Dialogue, he gave a speech about U.S. role in Asia and so forth. And other than some of the tone, you could have closed your eyes and it would have sounded very much like a speech that someone from the Biden administration could have given, or someone from the first Trump administration, or even maybe somebody toward the end of the Obama administration. Asia is the priority theater for the United States and the most important part of the world. China represents the greatest long-term challenge to the United States, and therefore that is one of the reasons why we need to be disproportionately focused on Asia. The U.S. alliance system in Asia is a significant value to the United States, with U.S. Japan alliance kind of at the forefront in the region. We want that alliance to be stronger. We want our allies to be stronger themselves on their own. I mean, all of this was pretty traditional stuff. But that's not the full content of the administration's approach to the world or to Japan or to Asia, as we know. And that's where you get some of these kind of internal conflicts. So on the one hand, you have, as Secretary of State Marco Rubio has said, we're not going to live in a world where China gets to dominate the Indo-Pacific. And he called the Japanese close allies of ours. You have the Hegseth speech. You have things like that. But then you look at the content of what's happening underneath, just the actions, in addition to sort of the rhetorical statements, and it's a more complicated picture. On the one hand, certainly on the economic side, as everybody knows here, the U.S. and Japan are extraordinarily tied. I mean, Japan's the sixth largest U.S. trade partner, the biggest foreign investor in the United States. Japanese investors are the biggest holders of U.S. treasuries. Of course, after the U.S. got cold feet on TPP, Japan picked up the flag and kept marching forward to CPTPP and so forth. Prime Minister Shiba was the second world leader to meet with President Trump during Trump's second term. During that visit, there was, again, some very traditional content to what the expressions were. They reemphasized the U.S. commitment to Japan's defense, Article 5 protections on the Senkakus, pledged closer cooperation on Taiwan. We're going to work together on critical technologies. We needed, free and open Indo-Pacific. All, again, fairly kind of traditional things. But on the other side of this scale, you look, for example, at the reactions or lack thereof, or sort of priorities with respect to China of the current administration. As recently as January, it was the case in Washington where everybody woke up in the morning, thought about China all day long, talked about China, and then went to bed talking about China. And, if anything, there was a criticism that too much was seen through the lens of U.S.-China competition. We're seeing technology and defense through that, and economics through that, and our relationships with Europe, and our relationships in Asia, and everything else. It's been very quiet out of the current administration on China-related issues, with the exception of tariffs and trade. There's been a little on the tech side. But you look at what's gone on just in the past few weeks, you've seen the PLA Navy practice an amphibious landing on Taiwan, complete with vessels that have, sort of these docks, which the troops could get ashore into Taiwan. Live fire exercises off the coast of Australia that interrupted commercial air traffic out of Sydney Airport. The Chinese claiming a feature in the South China Sea for the first time since 2006. So in 19 years they hadn't done that. They did that again. Just as recently as today, the Japanese Ministry of Defense reports there's 2 Chinese aircraft carriers operating in the Western Pacific, which have entered the Japanese EEZ. And, so far it's been really quiet in terms of even rhetorical reactions out of the administration, other than, again, on the tariff side. And so you sort of wonder, how does this square with China's the greatest long-term challenge, Asia's the most important region, our allies are the most important, and all this other stuff. Then you kind of look at the military resource picture. The Biden administration was pretty careful to aid Ukraine and do things in the Middle East without drawing down military resources from the Indo-Pacific theater. It was the case in 2022 that it was the first time in 20 years there hadn't been a carrier, or in 2020 actually, and there hadn't been U.S. carrier strike group on regular rotation in the Middle East in the CENTCOM AOR. Well, once the things flared up with Gaza and Israel, they went back, and today there's 2 carrier strike groups, not in that are in the CENTCOM AOR, and the military has redeployed missile defense assets from Indo-Pacific to the Middle East, and also recently they've gone back but put B-2s in Diego Garcia and other things. This is about the Houthis and Iran and all this other stuff. The President Trump said, I think it was just today, that if diplomacy fails with Iran, then force will be the next option that they consider. And so again, how does this square with, Asia's the most important, all this other stuff? Well, I wrote an entire book last year about how hard it is to pivot to Asia, which is not new to the Trump administration. Oh yeah, they're available in fine bookstores everywhere. Well, actually, probably not. Probably available on Amazon at least. But the difficulty in a global power like the United States fulfilling its stated commitment to put this region of the world first and its allies like Japan first bumps up against events and things going on in the other parts of the world and crises and all these other things. So that is not new. So you still have that phenomenon. And then on top of that, you have, as I was saying, the skepticism about some of these traditional truths of U.S. Foreign policy. So that then takes us, I guess, specifically to U.S. Japan. As everybody knows, the sort of issue of the day, of the month, maybe of the year is tariffs, tariffs, tariffs. The administration has said privately, I don't think they've quite explained this publicly, and it's led to a lot of confusion, that they're sort of charged with trying to come up with multiple objectives for the same tools, which is true, but that they are mutually exclusive. So, if you want tariffs for revenue, they've got to stay in place. If you want to produce reshoring, they've got to stay in place. If you want to use them for negotiating leverage, then they can be negotiated away. Well, how does that actually work? And as the administration officials will describe, at least privately, there's 3 categories of the tariffs as they think about it. There's the sectoral tariffs, the Section 232 tariffs on things like steel and aluminum and stuff. And that's things that the President of the United States decides should be made in the United States and shouldn't be made overseas, and we're going to basically put in place protections in order to raise the cost of foreign imports so that to incentivize manufacturing at home. Then you've got the 10% baseline tariff on almost the whole world, and that's essentially for revenue purposes, and supposedly that's everybody's to keep. That's not going anywhere. And then finally, you have everything else, which are the so-called reciprocal tariffs, and those are negotiating leverage. So if Japan's got a 24% tariff, then you got 14% that you can sort of use in negotiation, 10% yours to keep, and that's the administration's position. That has not been accepted, to say the least, by the Japanese side for, I think, obvious reasons that don't want to live with a 10% tariff, or these sectoral tariffs, which went from 25 to 50 on steel and aluminum. But that's where the administration is coming from on all of this. They thought that Japan would be the first country in the world to announce at least a framework deal, and then they could go out and tell everybody else around the world, see, first movers get the best deals, and then there'll just be this long line of countries waiting, and that has not happened. And I believe the trade minister came back over the weekend, to Tokyo empty-handed again this time. So we'll see kind of where this goes. I guess the next step is conversation between Prime Minister Ishida and President Trump at the G7 summit next week. But that's the tariff situation. The other thing that's happening it's significant in the U.S.-Japan relationship is the beefing up on the defense side. So you have, of course, Japan doubling its defense budget over 5 years and acquiring new capabilities that it has not had, like counterstrike capabilities, and also relaxing some of both the restrictions on its own activities, but also the way it talks about the Japanese role if there were to be a contingency over Taiwan or something like that. And all of this is sort of moving in a positive direction from an alliance standpoint. You also have the beefing up of joint commands, including on the American side, that are going to work ever more closely together. The 2 commands, both Japanese and American, inside Japan. You get these sort of hints where, now you hear American officials say, yeah, it's great, you're going to 2% of GDP, 3 would be really nice. Of course, they're telling the Europeans you should spend 5% on GDP. The U.S. is nowhere near 5% of GDP. So I guess this is not really, this is like do what we say, not what we do. And then, you have some things sort of hanging out there. It's good that there's not a host nation support negotiation this year or next year, because I think that would put some pressure on the relationship. Last time around, the Trump administration asked for a 5-fold increase in the payment that Japan was making. So that comes back for renewal in 2027, and it's sort of something to watch there. So you've got the defense side that's really converging in very productive ways as Japan gets stronger, as the two countries sort of operationalize the alliance in productive ways. You got the economic side, which is sort of moving apart in really dramatic ways. And then, of course, you've got the own kind of unpredictability of U.S. policy and politics writ large, stuff that's not necessarily specific to Japan, but nevertheless affects Japan, probably first and foremost of which is the Russia-Ukraine aspect. I mean, Japan has given billions of dollars in aid to Ukraine and has taken actions like many other countries to punish Russia, and has said quite clearly that outcomes in Russia-Ukraine and the lessons for the next would-be aggressor could potentially affect outcomes in Asia. And so there's a real kind of no kidding interest in what happens in Russia, Ukraine. We can get into it. I think the administration came in with really a naive sense of what would be possible on Russia, Ukraine, and what would be acceptable to the Russians. And now they're sort of stuck with both sides being not that far apart from where they were when this whole thing started. And now the president's saying, well, the U.S. might just walk away and say it's somebody else's problem. Those are the kinds of unpredictable actions that can have splashback on Japan over the longer run. That said, I think there will be a look to Japan. Japan, as everybody knows, and I said before, picked up the flag on TPP and brought it into CPTPP. There are certain lines of effort that the U.S., at least right now, is getting out of the business of doing. And I wonder whether there will be some sense that Japan should try to pick up at least some of this mantle. So one, for example, on foreign aid, I mean, USAID does no longer exist. Foreign aid has been cut by about 85%. Millennium Challenge Corporation is being abolished. And so you also look at international broadcasting, you look at democracy promotion institutions, all of those are being either dismantled or hollowed out in the United States. These are a lot of our self-power tools, which the U.S. and Japan and like-minded countries have used in Southeast Asia and in the Pacific and in other countries around the world where we wish to contest Chinese influence or build our own in this sort of soft power way. If the U.S. is not going to be involved in that, or at least not involved to the degree it was before, does that mean Japan does more, or does it mean we just kind of do less overall, and what are the consequences of that? So maybe I'll just close and, overall, I think there's strong agreement, certainly at the intellectual level, among Republicans and Democrats and different administrations. Again, as I was saying before, that Asia is the most important part of the world, and the U.S.-Japan alliance is the key relationship in that part of the world, and is key to everything we really care about, including deterrence and peace and stability in the region and to economic prosperity. How to interpret that and what to do with that, of course, is sort of, I think, still up for grabs. I guess the last thing I would say is, so last week I was, when I worked at the State Department, I worked for Rich Armitage, the great Rich Armitage. And he was on the board of CNAS, my think tank, and was my biggest mentor in the world. I was extremely close to Rich Armitage, and probably some in this room were as well. And the passing of him and Joe Nye so close together feels a little bit like the passing of a torch, but I don't know who the torch is necessarily being passed to and where they're going to run with that. I was at the memorial service at the Naval Academy last week for Rich Armitage, and it was a collection of people, some who had come in from Japan, Asia hands from different generations and things like that. But again, it was a group of people that were all sort of had this belief in the U.S.-Japan relationship in their blood, and really believed in it and believed in American leadership in the region and in the world. And so that, that generation is hand off the torch. But the question, I think, maybe the task for people in this room is, who picks that up and what direction do they lead it in next? Because somebody needs to do it. So I'll just stop there.
Richard, thank you very, very much for this, very, very thoughtful, and clear overview. Somehow get a little bit the feeling that you're very diplomatic, because certainly I think from the Japanese trade negotiators' perspective, this is not skepticism, but this is pretty hardball being played out already. But for Japan perspective, Jimbo Sensei, your interpretation of U.S.-Japan relations under Trump 2.0.
Well, thank you very much. I'd like to begin by thanking Asia Society for inviting me and International House of Japan, where I serve as a managing director of the programs. Have a long-standing strategic partner relationship with Asia Society. Very happy to be partnering on this event as well. And also, we serve as a secretariat for the Trilateral Commission since this year, which Richard is representing North American Committee in coordinating all the programs with us. So very happy to develop our relationship even further. So I will rather try to be playing a role as a discussant rather than pretending to behave that I understand the Trump 2.0. Because I've been, since the inauguration in January, I think we all are been overwhelmed by the flood of the presidential decision, directives, and executive orders, almost coming every night and day. And it's really hard to follow up what's been the case, starting from the very small, tiny things like do not use like a paper straw, changing the name of the Bay of Mexico into the Bay of America, to the kind of significant impact issue like reciprocal tariff, which has already been discussed. And I felt that this is something, as Richard mentioned, very unorthodox and unconventional compared to what we have been familiarized with the axis and layers of the U.S. Statecraft and what types of the U.S. Diplomatic kind of directions and thoughts that we have been learning since many decades ago. And then Richard mentioned about there are bipartisan shared like values like forward deployment of U.S. troops, enhancing and upholding of the free and open rule-based economic order and the freedom at home. And that has been questioned by this administration. But from geostrategic and somewhat, those kind of geostrategic point of view, my nature of the sense of the United States is the maritime superpower who has the kind of, friends and allies to engage globally, and then to uphold and preserve the rule-based international order for the public goods to enhance those kind of U.S. commitment in the region, and let those friends and allies to play its own role together with the United States. And that's a maritime power in the context of how the United States try to see the world. But I think that what the Trump administration, especially under the 2.0, has been developing is much more on the continental side of as if that it has been expanding at the concentric circles, starting from Canada, Mexico, and then to Panama, Greenland, Ukraine, Gaza, Iran. And those are the sequence of the event that has been happening, as if that there has been a center in Washington, D.C., or even in Florida, and then to expand those kind of layers of the engagement to those ends, which is, I think, quite an unconventional way of looking at how the United States foreign policy has been evolving. And here comes my question on this regard. There has been so many disruptions taking place in the United States relationship with those major powers, especially in the transatlantic relationship and NATO, and how to deal with Ukraine and U.S. Posture to how to make a deal with Russia. But as Richard mentioned, that there has been, to my sense, surprisingly, there has been a continuity rather than in the differences in the Indo-Pacific. Look at Ishiba's visit to Washington, D.C., so as Modi, and Hekthe's visit to Asia, all confirm with the existing agreements that we have done in the past administrations, and precisely try to kind of making sure that such kind of continuity has been the game of the play in the alliance relationship and how United States engage in the Indo-Pacific. And we have been wondering why this is the case in Asia. And the one hypothesis maybe it's that China is a significantly important player for the United States. It is the center core of the strategic competition in the U.S.-China relationship, so that you really have to, concentrate resources into the Asia-Pacific. That's what the prioritizers said in Washington, D.C., so that there should be a more continuity than differences in the Indo-Pacific, and that's number one. But I think second hypothesis we got is it might be the matter of the sequence of events. Trump may start by negotiating over Ukraine with Russia, and then try to make a deal with Iran over the nuclear issues, and then eventually they'll come to China. And so that meantime that you have an interval of the events, you may seeing it is as a continuity, but fundamental kind of approach that the Trump administration is making is about how to make a deal with them, even over the critical issue like a Taiwan or South China Sea. So in that context, that how much that the allies like Japan and Korea may have its assumption that how much that the durability of the allies and partnership may exist in the coming months and years is something really up to these kind of different assumptions that we have. And I'd like to seek the Richard opinion over those characteristics of how things will play out in the Indo-Pacific region. And second, I also like to touch upon Japan's role. Japan has made a significant strides, as Richard mentioned, expanding defense budget, aiming for 2% and doubling the size of the defense budget since 2022, acquiring counter-strike capabilities, building industrial cooperation with partners like Australia and also many like-minded states. But I think that we face a question, and are we merely aligning with the U.S. strategy or helping to shape it? So there's a growing concerns that the allies are being treated as instruments of the flexibility, and they're to widen America's decision space, not necessarily the co-author of the regional strategy. And this is something that I felt when I attended the Shangri-La Dialogue 2 weeks ago, when I listened carefully about what Secretary Heggs mentioned about the strategy. Of course, that the tone is about the continuity, countering China, strengthening the U.S. military, asking to allies to have a robust build-up on the defense. All things are fine, but the philosophy underlining his Hector's speech is the DoD's mission. The most important issue is to maximize the decision space for the president's decision, and which is very important. What is the meaning of the maximization of the decision space is to counter against the things that will minimize the decision space for the United States. So who is doing this? One is, of course, China. If China tried to change the status quo by force, that will narrow the decision space for the United States, and the United States needs to counter against this. So I'm not going to tolerate against those. But I think that who is squeezing the decision space is not only China, but it's also those are the allies who are not spending enough money on the defense or who are provocating to the adversaries to induce the United States commitment will, let the United States to engage more forcefully, which is not, I think, the favorite of the Hegfest mindset on how United States might operate. So that we understand that the role of the allies expected under the Trump 2.0 is to contribute to expand the decision space for the United States, precisely for the President Trump. But we understand the logic. But the important thing is that how much we spend the money on the defense and how much we try to contribute to the allies, it doesn't mean to maximize the United States engagement for the allies, defense of allies, and also to commitment to the region, because within those layers of the decision, there are so many things that the president can actually take, including negotiating with China. Okay, so these are the fundamental, I think, alliance management issue that is at stake under the Trump 2.0. And let me finish by raising some economic perspective, because there are so many, the business leaders here at the table. And I think that reciprocal tariff is, extraordinary, and it's quite fascinating to see our ministers is traveling almost every week to Washington, D.C. And obviously, there has been the reshuffling of things of how much those kind of economic stake, especially by looking at the industrial the structure issues at home, especially for the allies, and then how much we can really mitigate the trade deficit volume vis-a-vis the United States. It's those kind of technical things are there. So here comes my my fundamental question is. The one is that the reciprocal tariff has been imposed to more than 150 plus countries. They are lining up of the countries. And Scott Bess and Latnik can only negotiate probably 10 plus countries at the same time. So there are so many countries who are waiting to negotiate with the United States. And then if you look at Southeast Asia and the South Asia widely, there are high, I think, percentage of the tariff has been imposed, and it's been extended for extension for the implementation. But if the 19-day has passed, if there's no extension anymore, there will be almost like the huge shock of the trade diversion take place in many of Asian countries. So in my assumption here is that the United States is bound to lose the influence, especially over Southeast Asia, and how much that Japan, Australia, India can really fill the gap is quite unknown. And Hegfest actually asked the Asian allies to reduce the dependence on China. But under the circumstances that you are imposing the reciprocal tariff to them, it is almost contradictory how much that United States can really deal with the rest of the world. And we are very much concerned about these situations. There are so many issues that allies and partners cannot replace the role of the United States, starting from the nuclear extended deterrence, but also the conflict resolution capability, and also as a kind of the, how do you call it, the regional economic order that the United States and also like-minded states can share. Currently, we are so much concerned that the US is absent from this. I'll stop here.
Right. Thank you, Jimbo Sensei. That's again wonderful food for thought. Richard, maybe you want a quick sort of rebuttal?
Well, not rebuttal, but agreement. I wish I could rebut the criticisms, but even though they were very light. But I mean, the answer to, for example, your last point about isn't there a contradiction because the United States wants to counter Chinese influence in places like Southeast Asia while it simultaneously closes off access to its market to Southeast Asia? Yeah, it's terrible policy. I mean, the right policy would be to identify areas in the U.S.-China relationship that involve national security risk, either because of what we are dependent on or things that are supplied to China, and then to trade more with our friends and allies and partners in those areas. Not to say we will trade less in those areas and we'll trade less with everybody across the entire world, and then we'll somehow figure out how to make that stuff at home. So the answer to your question is it's just bad policy, and there's not a lot of logic. And when, if you look at American influence and the desire to counter Chinese influence in different parts of the world, what are our biggest assets, right? We don't have a bunch of state-directed financial funds that we can put here and there and all this other kind of stuff. We have access to the world's biggest market, which we are restricting rather than expanding. We have our array of soft power tools that I mentioned before. We've got foreign aid and infrastructure financing and international broadcasting and democracy promotion activities and humanitarian assistance, all of which we are dismantling or significantly shrinking. And then we have kind of the things that we do together with our allies in those parts of the world. And we're moving backwards on those things. So I wish I could rebut, but I think it's extremely valid criticism where we are. And I think at some point, hopefully sooner rather than later, we may wake up and say, wait, there's actually a reason why we had these instruments before, and there's a reason why we did some of these things before, and we kind of miss it now that it's gone, but then we will have to change.
I mean, it's interesting because in my little world of investment, the unintended consequences of what America is doing, just look at the data. You find, fine, you're going to make it more difficult for China to sell products into the United States. That's okay. What is the result? The result is that China is dumping its excess capacity into third markets. And if you look at it, this comes for Japan at a very critical juncture because China is no longer just making toys and paper, but actually has perfectly fine robotics companies, perfectly fine factory automation companies who are now taking market share from the leading stars of Japan. If you look at Fanuc, the robotics maker, one of the leading stars of Japan. If you look at Keyence, the factory automation companies, global orders down 30, 40% over the last year. And the reason is that in third countries, what loosely we can call the global south, you find that made in China is now not just competing on price, but is in addition competing on price because of the U.S. tariffs, and now actually does have the after service and client service function in place as well. So it's very interesting. We talk about U.S. Japan, where there's a lot that needs to be discussed, but by America exercising its might is right, my way or the highway policies, right? There's a lot of unintended consequences that are actually, cutting into the trustworthiness of the U.S.-Japan relationship. Do you think, let me ask you, Richard, you're in Washington, right?
Well, not right now, but generally, yes.
Right now you're in Tokyo, the greatest place on earth. No, but like in all seriousness, I mean, so it's fine. There's this sort of might is right policy, and Trump never makes a mistake. But is there actually a plan? Like, is anybody coordinating anything there? Or is it just like, oh, it sounds like a good idea, we can raise tariffs and thereby give Americans a tax cut?
Well, their plan was they were going to get a bunch of deals very, very quickly, so that the things that you just talked about and that we were just talking about wouldn't unfold because you would actually have deals that benefited the United States. Now, how that squared with a 10% baseline tariff, it doesn't. But they seem to think that that was sort of the way things were going to end up, with Japan being the first in the queue, and that they'd have a deal within days, or at least a framework deal. And so, the people in the administration who talked about this and their sort of supporters outside the administration said, ultimately this is going to lead to, I mean, I thought this at the time was kind of a wild idea, but this is going to lead to overall trade liberalization because there's so many countries that have restrictions on our trade with them, but we don't have it on theirs. And so what Trump is doing is stocking the deck of negotiating leverage, and he wants to use it. And this is all ultimately about getting deals. But of course, we don't see the deals. And when you don't see the deals, then you're stuck with the things you put in place to try to achieve that, even if that's the case. So there was a plan, but I don't think the plan has yet and may never work out according to its internal logic. I
mean, it's quite the contrary. Sorry, just to play hardball for 30 seconds. There was a deal with the UK.
Yeah.
It's a terrible deal.
Yeah.
It's a terrible deal, not necessarily in terms of like what's the concrete economic impact, close to nothing, but much more importantly, it's a deal that is completely untrustworthy, right? And particularly that clause that, we reserve the right as America to impose additional and new tariffs on you, when we decide that your dealings with the People's Republic of China is not going according to the way we want to.
Yeah,
How does that, if you're Akazawa-san or if you're Ishiba-san, how do you look at that?
Well, I don't know what you can agree to, but now there's so much uncertainty with the court case that's hanging over all of this to see whether these tariffs are actually going to be declared legal or not, which will go to the Supreme Court. And then, I think the administration, let's just say the solidity of its credibility on particular negotiating positions is not rock solid because, if you say, so countries want to buy time. Right? They want to buy time because they think...
We're not buying time. America is just losing credibility.
But like the UK, for example, right? So you can agree to something, at least theoretically, you can agree to something that has these kinds of... you just don't know how long this is going to last because the administration may say, I don't know, you're stuck with a 10% tariff forever, but that may last another 24 hours until, they change their mind. So
this is not... doesn't get the golf course permit.
This is not a traditional trade negotiation where you have chapters and you start to look at the tariff levels and the quota levels at each place, and maybe you look at some other things like what are the rules for digital trade, and you have this long negotiation and people stay up all night and all this other kind of stuff, and then that is the furthest thing from this that you can imagine.
No, but it's very interesting. Again, just Jimbo-san, please chime in. It's like, the world needs an enforcer, right? The world needs somebody who will actually enforce the global rules-based order. And that credibility, every day that passes, is being eroded.
Right. So we'll go to your second, but just on this, this gets back to the first point I was making. So you said the U.S. or the world needs someone to enforce the global rules. And I think the administration thinks that has been the problem, that the United States has been enforcing rules that benefit the globe rather than rules that benefit the United States. And if that happens at the expense of other countries, okay. And if that doesn't happen at the expense of other countries, fine. But they're in the business of trying to establish rules that will benefit Americans as they see it, not global order, not global institutions, not the WTO and its dispute resolution mechanism, not multilateral trade frameworks where the United States is one country among many. This is America first.
Yep. Jimbo-sensei.
I'd like to jump into this conversation. And seemingly after the triple red victory in the elections, and seems to be that there's a huge concentration of power in the White House, especially towards the president. And as you mentioned, that he's tried to overcome the constraints of any kind of international restriction from the institution rules and all. But something that I think still plays a check and balance role in the Trump administration is I think the power of the market and also the pressure from the election. And those two aspects seems to be playing the huge role. And taking a look at case of the China issue, and when we were both in Washington, D.C., the reciprocal tariff has been announced, and the ridiculous amount of the escalation has played around until 145% at the maximum, and then suddenly reduced to 115% at the kind of quick negotiation they have done. And I think what really pushed the Trump administration, first on the extension of the 90 days, is the bond market. Probably it's the sense of the financial crisis really creates that you've got to extend the implementation. That's number one. And on the 115% case, seems to be that the pressure from the retailers and like Walmart's and if that 140-something% will be imposed, you cannot have Halloween and you cannot have a Thanksgiving and Christmas, and Walmart's will be out of the stocks, and those are the kind of real pressure probably that the market may really impose. And then now it's the telephone conversation between President Trump and President Xi Jinping. That's a rare earth once again. And China has restricted the export of the rare earth that really hit directly to the automobile industry in the United States. And Trump has to deal with it. So that I think that the market still plays a huge role in adjusting the Trump's policy. And I would like to have this point of view on, your viewpoint on this. And the second is on the election upcoming, especially the midterm. And historically speaking, there are averagely like 25 seats that the ruling party will lose, especially in the lower house, the House. So that I don't know that the margin is only like a 8-something seat between the Republican and the Democrats, and what going to be the case if there will be a huge pressure on the midterm, and would that be a kind of adjustments to bring Trump administration to have a much more sensible way, making the policy into the more into the some kind of adjusted strategy, or what's your viewpoint as?
Yeah, I think that there's a bunch of checks and balances in the system, most of which are just starting to kick in. So there's some that you just mentioned. I mean, the bond market reaction when the yields on U.S. 30-year treasuries is higher than the yield on Greek sovereign debt. I think the administration really kind of freaked out, and so they announced this pause and all of that. The courts, because I mean, not just on tariffs, but on other things, the courts are constraining influence. The states on some issues are constraining influence. I mean, including potentially on tariffs, because there's a lawsuit. There's this lawsuit by the states themselves, or if you see what's playing out in Los Angeles now, there's this. So popular opinion, the reaction of other governments around the world. I mean, when you're the president of the United States, you are the prime mover. I mean, you can do a lot and move very, very fast and throw a lot of new things out there, and it takes a while for those reactions to start in. But when those reactions start in, then you have seen the administration to some degree react to that. The other thing I just think politically is that this is going to become more acute as we get closer to the midterm election, because I'm of the view that President Trump was politically strongest on Inauguration Day, and his political power is going to decline. I mean, he's a lame duck, and so he's an unusual lame duck, but a lame duck nevertheless. And at the end of the day, Republicans, Democrats, everybody's going to want to get reelected. And so if there opens up a gap between what people in the districts and the states think benefits them in terms of Trump policy on the economics, and the Republicans have to go in one direction, even if that means criticizing Trump on tariffs or something like that, because they're inflationary. They will totally do it if they think their seat is up for that. So I think the real question is, what is the slope of the decline in his political power going to look like? Is it going to be pretty flat for most of the 4 years, or going to be rather steep? But it's going to decline. And so all of those things are going to be kicking in, and the administration will abandon some of these efforts, as it has already and as it did in the first term.
But it's interesting, right? Because let's say that this is true and that we have a lame duck with blonde hair, but in terms of international relations, in terms of trustworthiness, whether it's U.S. Japan, whether it's U.S. Europe, whether it's U.S. China, can America regain the trust? Because fine, so the aggressiveness is going to calm down because of checks and balances kicking in. But like you pointed out, America does, the questioning of these fundamental concepts that you outlined at the very beginning of your talk, right? That skepticism is not going to go away.
Yeah, I think part of it depends on exactly what it is you're putting your trust in. So, if you're talking about big security issues, I mean, there are a lot of countries, including Japan, that don't have a lot of good alternatives to a strong alliance with the United States, or at least not a lot of attractive alternatives. So, there may be some erosion of trust for this reason or that reason, but it may not materialize very vividly. On other things, do you have trust that a negotiating position announced by the administration today is going to stick? I wouldn't. I mean, so those are sort of your two poles, and everything else is kind of is in the middle. That said, trade disputes between the U.S. and Japan are not new. Ups and downs in the U.S.-Japan relationship are nothing new. You can go back to 1971 and Nixon stopping the convertibility of gold. You can go back to the Plaza Accord. You can go back to the popular stuff in the 80s, which I think Trump still lives in this in his head with, Nintendo is trying to buy the Seattle Mariners and, we're all going to, cook hamburgers.
Well, Japan has made American baseball great.
Well, that is absolutely true. That's true. Babe Ruth has come back, and he turns out to be Japanese, pitching and hitting. But there have been ups and downs, and the relationship certainly can weather this if there is not too much damage done over too long a period of time, and that's a pretty big if.
So it's very interesting. I mean, I have a slightly different opinion on this. I think what has changed from the 1980s is in the 1980s, there was no China. Today, there is China. And we can argue about the internal dynamics of China. Jimbo Sensor spends a lot of time there. But it's no longer a bilateral relationship. America is a $30 trillion economy. China is a $20 trillion economy. The next 7 guys are between 4 and 4.5. And it's interesting to see. And let me ask you, this is my final question, and then for the audience, please prepare yours. What do you see? Is China going to exploit this American weakness?
Well, they're already exploiting the current set of events, if you want to put it that way. So, I mean, in very concrete, specific ways. So, for example, the U.S. has fired local employees at embassies all over the world, and especially those who had worked for USAID. So many of those are being approached by China, the government of China now, saying, hey, would you like a job? You seem to know a lot. You know a lot about America. You know have a lot of connections, things like that. I mean, strangely, even local groups that were being funded by U.S. democracy support institutions in the United States are approached by the government of the PRC, which is a little strange because they're not really in the business of democracy promotion, but nevertheless, they're making a good run at it and things like that. At a narrative level, of course, the Chinese will say, well, you have this kind of, very narrowly construed self-interested America that's unpredictable and, all this other stuff. While, we're not going anywhere, we're here, you can count on us. And by the way, would you like to work with us on this or that or the other thing? That said, China tends to be its own worst enemy on these things. And so when it's had opportunities, I mean, you look at during COVID when the United States really had kind of withdrawn from a lot of its traditional, international activities. I mean, this really was almost beggar thy neighbor when it came to vaccines and PPE and all this other kind of stuff. And, the walls were up and all of this. I mean, this was a golden opportunity for China to say, look, we're going to have this expansive view and show how benign Chinese power is in the world. They successfully alienated most of the countries in the world simultaneously. You know how hard it is to anger the Canadians? I mean, we've done it now. We've done it now. The Canadians are wonderful people. They're nice, they're kind, they're polite. The Chinese alienated the Canadians, which shows you can do anything. And then now we're in the business of doing that too, right? So, the Chinese can be as daft as us, which is going to be, I think, part of our saving grace.
Please, any questions from the audience?
My name is Takehiro from Sophia University. My question would be for Professor Jimbo about national and international security. It seems like we don't have active dialogue between the United States and China on military activities. During Cold War, they have engaged discussion about reduction of nuclear weapons or stopping the budget expansion. How do you think what is going on right now between China and the United States, and what could be the expected role to Japan to getting to stop this escalation? Thank you.
I think Richard can handle this question much better than I do, but let me try. And I think definitely that both institutional, and also the active exchange between the United States and China has been dramatically reduced, especially technically speaking, after the Speaker Nancy Pelosi's visit to Taiwan. There has been the cancellation of so many confidence-building measures that the United States and China has cultivated over past years, including those early notification of the military exercises and exchange of the crisis management types of the information, and many of those procedure kind of things to communicate with each other. There are the technical but the very important way to maintain the confidence between two sides. Some has been resumed, but not fully, and this is the part of the reason why those kind of miscommunications and mishandling of the interpretations, misinterpretations could easily evolve over many of the situation, which is very concerning to us. And that is also true for Japan. After the Senkaku incident, that we have developed our maritime and air communication mechanisms, which has been enacted already. But utilization of this mechanism under the tense situation, for example, Richard talked about the sailing of the aircraft carrier, evolving to the intrusion of the EEZ. Whether that is the matter of the communication between two sides, I don't think so. And this has not seems to be happening effectively. So that once you really have to create the kind of real crisis management mechanisms, you definitely need to have a mechanism, and then you really have to put your spirit into what is the shared notion of the risks, dangers, escalations, and what is the red line between the two. If those kind of notion has been agreed upon, like what has been, shared between the United States and the Soviet Union during the war, Cold War, because it's a certain level of understanding, you cannot really cross over this line. But it is not happening in China over many of the issues, which is my concern.
Right. Richard, quick follow on.
Yeah, I mean, you're right. There's no arms control negotiations going on between the United States and China. There won't be on nuclear weapons anytime soon. I mean, China is going to aim at 1,200 or so warheads, and only when they get to parity with the United States will they be potentially willing to have talks with the United States. I mean, it's very hard to imagine why they would have an interest in, as much as we'd like to do it, and the U.S. has pushed them very hard to do it, but it's hard to see why they would have an interest in talks before they reach parity on the nuclear side. On other things, I mean, there have been crisis hotlines set up, but those, I mean, it's basically a phone line. And so when there's a crisis, the problem is the Chinese don't pick up the phone; they just let it ring. I think there's some possibilities out there. Space arms control. I mean, we all have an interest in not shooting each other's satellites and all the debris that causes and things like that. Maybe some talks, at least on AI safety. It's hard to see that we'd get some sort of binding agreement, but talks on that kind of thing. So I think there's a few possibilities here. But there's a fundamental philosophical difference between the U.S. approach and the Chinese approach. The U.S. approach tends to be, look, these two countries are relatively hostile to each other, and that puts a real premium on arms control measures so that we can reduce the risk associated with this relationship. And the Chinese will say, no, you need to create the conditions for good negotiations in the first place. So you start with the nature of the relationship, you improve the nature of the relationship, and then that produces the arms control negotiations and outcomes, rather than you get the arms control negotiation outcomes because the relationship is so bad that's sort of your safety net. But that's sort of where we are.
Thank you. Emmanuel Pastorash, Asian Institute here in Tokyo. I wanted to ask specifically about the question of science, which seems to me to be the most fundamental issue here. So on two fronts. One is the decision of the Trump administration to freeze, for example, the National Science Foundation, to restrict funding for fundamental science research, and also the visa issue for students, since America is so dependent upon that. And this seems to impact national security, production, economics all around, but especially because technology is dependent on the basic science, and the United States it's running on science from 25, 30 years ago, and if we lose that being on the forefront in science, basic science, that would have catastrophic impact in all the fields that we've discussed so far. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, there's been a lot of concern raised about the reductions in funding for basic science and R&D that will, in many areas, be funded only by the government. I mean, you're not going to have the private sector come in particular areas, and that has obvious national competitiveness and national security implications and so forth. On the visa thing, again, this is where some of the anti-immigration ideology bumps up against other policies that one would want to have because there's a strong and increasingly dominant view, I think, in the administration. For example, the U.S. universities have become global universities, and that's bad, and they shouldn't be. These are American universities, should be for Americans, and not very hard to get into because the whole world and Xi Jinping's daughter is going to it and all this other stuff. So, you've got to do something about this, and let's start with Harvard because, and all of that. But the worst case outcome, it would seem to me, is to have lots of foreign students, including from potential adversary countries, come and get highly educated in the United States and then not let them stay and contribute to our economy. That I just don't get. But that may be where we end up because they come in as students, but then they can't stay with their follow-on visas for 1 or 2 or 3 years based on that. Hopefully cooler heads will prevail. I mean, this is a combination of the DOGE cutting funding in the science areas sort of across the board, and then on the visa stuff, the sort of immigration impulse. But hopefully we can net out in a decent place there. I mean, I will say the one thing on the other side of this that the administration's been pretty vociferous about is trying to remove the barriers to the United States being in the lead on AI, which of course is all done in the private sector. There's 5 frontier AI models, all of which are owned by American companies. There's certain things that are going to be required, chips, electricity, things like that, in order to stay at the frontier, and they're systematically trying to remove the barriers or put things into place. But that's a different aspect of the issue than what you're talking about.
Jimbo-sensei, little comment on that?
Right. I think that there have been so many cases that I know have been encountering the trouble, gaining visa, extending visa, who try to get into the U.S. universities and who are already in the universities. And that is really a worldwide effect. If that is the case, to punish the symbolically elite, top status university, I hope that the cooler heads should prevail in order to mitigate the issue. But if the issue is more ideologically try to exclude the foreigners entering into the United States, especially in the higher education field, that will, I think, impact even towards the friends and allies of the United States will be very high. We are already encountering the very unpredictable situation. For in the age of 18 or 22 who are engaged in the higher studies, may probably won't take that choice of getting into the U.S. university because it's too risky right at this moment. And I think that that's a huge missing opportunity for both the U.S. and also for those talented foreigners who wish to study in the United States. So I'm personally very much concerned about the situation.
So it's very interesting on that. For 30 seconds, some facts. You have, it's your loss, our gain. You've got even, the solid institution of Osaka University, accepting 200 American scientists. And of course, we're not talking about the superstar professors. We're talking about the postdocs, the assistant professors, who are on 2 or 3 year contracts. And it's very interesting. You've had in my home country, Germany, a very aggressive campaign by the Max Planck Institute to attract those people. France is doing exactly the same thing. The Middle East is $150 million set aside just to attract American, scientists to come there. So it's going to be very, very interesting, in the sense of that, the world, and particularly this is very important for Japan, because Japan is in this process of trying to internationalize its universities, to internationalize its deep research capabilities. And this is actually a golden opportunity. And mark my words, there's going to be a supplementary budget on that, even though it's not going to get Ishiba reelected.
So, Terry Porte, co-chair of Asia Society Japan and global trustee of Asia Society. So let's think ahead here and dream a little bit. It's 2029. The other side wins. How difficult is it to put Humpty Dumpty together again? And I ask that, I hope, without any rancor or too much cynicism, but as an American who also happens to be French. But an American who has lived overseas since 1983, the United States has always been America first in its foreign policy. Certainly, if you're a Japanese, you would feel that way. And frankly, the United States has often been a bully. Maybe sometimes it's a more polite, friendly-looking bully, but still a bully nonetheless. So will it be very hard to go back, or do we have to maneuver differently, or how do you see all that going forward in such a scenario?
Yeah, you can look, I think, as one example of the Biden administration and what changed and didn't after the first Trump administration. Biden never would have put 35% tariffs on China if he had been president when Trump was, but he kept them all when he was there. And not only did he keep all the other tariffs on all the other countries, he added a few in his spare time. Trump got out of the Iran nuclear deal. Biden would not have gotten out of the Iran nuclear deal, wanted to get back in, but he didn't or couldn't because the terms had changed. Trump got out of the Paris Climate Accord. Biden got back in. Trump wanted to pull out of the WHO. Biden stopped that. How material were those things? I don't know. Hard to say. Trump went from railing against our allies to Biden saying we love our allies and there's nobody more important to us in the whole world than allies, which, to your point, led a lot of our allies to think, well, there's a new game in town. The Americans are going to be really cuddly and nice, and they're going to come listen to us before they make decisions. And then, and those who hadn't been through this before had to explain, Trump was a particular manifestation, especially in his tone and his rhetoric. But the traditional way of, for example, consulting with allies that Americans do is we tell you what the decision is going to be made before it's announced. We don't ask you what you think should happen and then sort of take that into account and then come up with something that's going to make everyone happy. I mean, that's not tends to be the American way. The courtesy is we'll let you know before the statement goes out, right? Which is often seen as bullying, even by the nice guy presidents, right? So I think to your point, some of this is what we're seeing now is very unique and very different and a big departure, and some of it isn't. It's just more in your face than it normally is. So could we have a return to the less in your face but still American approach? Yeah, I think so.
I don't know how to respond, but famous Ambassador Fujisaki's, the story was that the result of the American president is like a Christmas present opening this. You cannot know until you open the present, and then present, and then you must say that this is what I want, and so which truly means that the United States plays the very important cornerstone for Japan's defense and security policy, and also Japan's statecraft. Whoever become the president in the United States, there's a very little path that Japan can pursue other than Plan A. And Plan A dash could be there, but the Plan B is unthinkable. So in that context, that the constraint of the Japanese, I think, alternative, we call it strategic autonomy, is pretty much limited in a way that we should really create something to induce the United States into the world order that we believe. First of all, whatever the Trump administration may say about the rule-based international order, this is our national interest. We rely on the oil in the Middle East that has to goes through the safety of the sea lanes of communication. We rely on the financial markets and trade market, which has to be embedded by the Bretton Woods agreement. That's for national interest, which is, I think, very important. And then we are not going to get away from this. But I think that the way that, how the Plan A dash can induce the United States into the Plan A eventually is increasingly difficult task for Japan. And this is where we are.
Terry, for 30 seconds, it's very interesting. I think to Jimbo's point, and I think Richard, you would agree. The one thing we do know about Mr. Trump is that money is boss. And markets matter. The United States of America, for the S&P 500 companies, 53% of the earnings are generated from interacting with the rest of the world. And the rest of the world not doing so well as a result of, sooner or later, this stuff is going to start to get noticed. So, the corrective mechanism from that side. Now, whether that has an effect on the cultural revolution that Mr. Trump and his team are trying to engender on America, which is not the America that you as a Frenchman and I as a German and many of our Japanese friends loved, when we were young men and women, that's a much bigger question mark coming from there. Thank you.
I'm Meenakshi. I lead Asia Society's operations in India, and I happen to be transiting through. And Savako, thank you for inviting me for this absolutely stimulating discussion. Richard, I wanted to, just shift the gear a little bit. We've spoken a lot about economics and politics, but related to your piece on strongmen, we seem to have a huge rise in strongmen across the world. And I think they thrive on narrative building. And I'm wondering, in the US, there seems to have been this huge narrative that's been built about large parts of the US having been excluded from development and growth. J.D. Vance talks about it in his book when he refers to the hillbilly elegies. And, I remember when I was many years ago a part of Harvard's South Asia Institute, there was reference to the need to build a center in Midwest America to truly understand what the challenges of the Midwest are. I wanted your comment on how true is this whole narrative about development having left a lot of people in the US behind? Is it just political expediency which has been sort of woven into this narrative and repeated many times too often? Or is there a lot of truth in this? And is that something that successive Democrat governments over the last few years have actually faltered on, which is the reason why the US is in the predicament that it is today?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, there is truth behind a lot of the facts on the ground. I mean, there are communities in the United States that have been completely hollowed out economically, rural areas and towns where you can go down Main Street and every building is shuttered, but you still have people living there. The opioid crisis has devastated some of these places, just been absolutely lethal, especially for young men. And you have suicide rates quite high and things like that. That is separate from the diagnosis of why that happened, and that too is separate from the prescription of what one might do about it. I mean, the narrative right now tends to be, especially kind of on the Trump supporting side, that this is a product of the elites pursuing their own interests in globalization. So it's a product of mass migration into the United States, which has depressed wages, trade, which has shipped manufacturing jobs overseas and hollowed out manufacturing communities, and basically an elite that has sort of moved the economic system into a place where it will benefit them no matter whether there's a global financial crisis or not, but everybody else is completely buffeted by these forces that are beyond their control. The problem with that, of course, is, and so, if we hadn't let China in the WTO or something like that, then things would be totally different. Well, there's a number of economic drivers over time, automation and, the rise of broadband services, allow for the offshoring of services and all kinds of economic changes that have led, and urbanization where people have moved to the cities and all kinds of things that have led to that. There have been some trade dislocations. But I think the fundamental claim, which is that this has all been rigged by an elite pursuing its own interests, and that if you only apply the good common sense of the American people, then you will restore manufacturing, you'll reopen the coal mines, the steel mines will keep going here, people can move from their service jobs back into the factories, that you'll sort of show those who sort of always lorded it over the working class that their day is done and it's a new era. I don't think that's the future of the U.S. economy.
Fantastic question, and delighted to have our colleague from India with us here today. One other aspect of this where I think there is legitimate grievance and actually a serious problem. So if you look at America in the mid-1970s to today, the population of the United States has increased 50%. And at the same time, the capacity of the elite universities, not just the Ivy League, but let's take the top 40 or 50 universities, the capacity of those universities has increased by 0%. And at the same time in those universities, on average, there is one administrator, at least one administrator, if not more, per academic professor. There is a grievance in America in the middle and upper middle class that I can't get my kid into one of these universities. And that is indeed true because of this problem of the lack of increase of capacity. And this is something that America has to fix. And it can be fixed. But the universities, who have plenty of other things to work on at the same time, have to figure out how they're going to increase their capacity. They're going to have to use some creativity to see how, for example, you can use online learning and at the same time residential learning and putting more professors in the classroom and maybe reducing the number of administrators and using all of that physical plant year-round so that there can be more opportunity for average Americans. That is a big issue that I think after we get through this crisis, the leading universities are going to have to tackle.
Great. I'm German. We are in Japan. We got to stay on time. Richard, absolutely fascinating.
Thank you.
I'm kind of like, very, very admirable to be out here. Just I think one comment. I think all of us, over the last 30, 40 years, have looked at America, as a leading light in many different ways. All of us have benefited from the generosity and, from the education and the ability to do things freely, to pursue our dream in America, and then importing some of that back to the countries that we work in. This view is obviously being challenged. And I think it behooves us to actually make sure that civil society continues to work, continues to have the exchanges, whether it's the JET program, whether it is, internship exchanges within Japanese corporations, whether it is, mobilizing good leaders like Ms. Takaichi. No, sorry. But you understand the point. There's obviously a stress test that is going on here. And the one thing that we all admire about America is its ability to change very quickly. And that ability, that ambition, that going after your dream, after the dream for your community, is not going to go away. It's being challenged. But, I have a lot of faith that, America will come through this, and once again emerge as a leading light. In the meantime, let's hope that Japan is going to become its own leading light. Thank you very much.